October 1997. Charlotte, North Carolina. Some people dream their whole lives about striking it rich. David Ghantt, a mild-mannered vault supervisor at Loomis Fargo, decided he was done dreaming. On one fateful October evening, this unassuming armored car employee put into motion what should have been the perfect heist, vanishing into the night with over $17 million in cold, hard cash. What followed was an international manhunt that would baffle the FBI, expose a murder conspiracy, and prove that sometimes the biggest crimes are undone by the smallest acts of stupidity. Before we dive into how David achieved this, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit that subscribe button if you're new to True Crime Case Notes. Smash the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment letting me know what country you're watching from. Seriously, knowing this community spans every continent makes every investigation worth it. Now, let's get back to the story and uncover how a simple vault supervisor could pull this off. Sunday morning, October 5th, 1997, 7:15 a.m. The phone rang at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. On the other end of the line was a worried woman named Tammy Ghantt. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. Her husband, David, hadn't come home from his overnight shift at the Loomis Fargo warehouse. It wasn't like him. David was reliable, predictable, the kind of man who always came home. Something felt terribly wrong. The Charlotte Police Department dispatched a patrol officer to investigate what seemed like a routine welfare check. When the officer arrived at the Loomis Fargo facility, an eerie stillness hung in the air. David Gantt's white pickup truck sat abandoned in the parking lot outside the warehouse gate. The chain-link fence, which should have been locked and secured, stood wide open. So did the massive warehouse door. The officer stepped out of his patrol car, hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. He surveyed the scene carefully. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. But something was definitely off. The building's entrance gaped open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. He radioed dispatch immediately. Within the hour, Charlotte police had contacted Loomis Fargo's management. A supervisor arrived at the facility, keys jangling nervously in his hand as he tried to make sense of what had happened. He led the police officer through the warehouse, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. David Ghantt is nowhere to be found, the supervisor said, his face pale. The vault is locked, but all the keys are missing. He paused, swallowing hard. One of our company vans is gone too. The officer frowned. Any signs of forced entry? The supervisor shook his head. None. Nothing broken. No damage to the locks. It's like whoever did this had authorization to be here. That's when the pieces started falling into a terrifying pattern. David Ghantt worked the closing shift the night before. He was scheduled to secure the vault along with a trainee. He had full access, full clearance, full trust. Let's check the security footage, the supervisor suggested, his voice tight with dread. They made their way to the security office, a cramped room lined with monitors and VCR equipment. The supervisor's hands shook slightly as he reached for the videotapes from the security cameras. 2 of the VCRs were empty. The tapes had been removed. Someone took them, the officer said, stating the obvious. But there was one camera they hadn't checked yet, a third surveillance system tucked in a different cabinet. The supervisor pulled open the cabinet door and discovered a VCR still recording, its tape intact and running. We got something, he breathed. They rewound the tape and hit play. The grainy black and white footage flickered to life on the monitor. And there, moving methodically through the frame, was David Ghantt himself. No mask, no disguise, no weapon pointed at his back by some unseen criminal. Just David, calm, collected, unhurried, systematically emptying the vault. Stack after stack of cash, bundle after bundle of bills, loading it all into a white company van like he was moving furniture on a Saturday afternoon. The officer and supervisor watched in stunned silence. My God, the supervisor whispered. He robbed us. David Ghantt robbed his own company. The Charlotte police immediately escalated the situation. Because the stolen money belonged to federally insured banks, this wasn't just a robbery. It was a federal crime. By that afternoon, the FBI had been called in. This was no ordinary theft. When FBI agents arrived at the Loomis Fargo warehouse and began processing the scene, they quickly realized the scope of what they were dealing with. The vault, once filled with millions of dollars destined for ATMs and bank branches across the region, was completely empty. David Ghantt, a trusted employee with an honorable military discharge and no criminal record, had walked out with $17.3 million in untraceable cash. Most of it was in $20 bills, the kind used to stock ATM machines. None of the currency was marked. The serial numbers weren't sequential. It was the perfect score, completely untraceable money, and the thief had a 24-hour head start. But here's what made this case so bizarre, so absolutely baffling to the FBI. David Ghantt wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't a career thief. He was just David, a guy who worked overtime to pay off credit card debt. A church-going family man who lived in a mobile home with his wife and followed her strict household budget. How does someone like that pull off one of the largest cash heists in American history and then disappear without a trace? As FBI Special Agent Mark Rozzi stood in that empty vault, staring at the barren shelves where millions once sat, one question burned in his mind. Who helped him? Because nobody, absolutely nobody, pulls off a heist this big alone. Somewhere out there, David Ghantt had accomplices. People who helped him plan it. People who helped him move the money. People who were right now enjoying stolen millions while the FBI scrambled to figure out what happened. What the FBI didn't know yet, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that this perfect crime was already unraveling in the most spectacularly stupid ways possible. David Gantt's partners weren't criminal masterminds either. They were greedy, reckless, and incapable of keeping a low profile. And their mistakes, buying mansions in cash, flashing 20s at every store in town, getting breast implant for relatives, would lead the FBI straight to their door. But that was just the beginning. Before this investigation was over, the FBI would uncover a murder plot, race across international borders to save a man's life, and watch as $17 million in stolen cash vanished into tanning beds, velvet Elvis paintings, and the most absurd spending spree in criminal history. This is the true story of America's dumbest heist. A crime so perfect in execution and so catastrophically stupid in aftermath that it baffled even the FBI. And it all started with one question from a worried wife on a quiet Sunday morning. Has anyone seen my husband? The manhunt for David Ghantt and his unknown accomplices was officially underway. Hundreds of agents, thousands of leads, one missing vault supervisor, and somewhere out there, over $17 million in cash that had simply vanished. What the FBI would soon discover was that finding David Ghantt wouldn't be the hard part. Keeping him alive long enough to testify against his partners? That would be the real challenge. Because David Gantt's accomplices had a plan for him too, and it didn't involve sharing the money. The FBI had handled hundreds of robbery cases, bank heists, armored car stick-ups, sophisticated criminal operations. But sitting in the Charlotte field office that Monday morning, staring at the surveillance footage of David Ghantt calmly emptying that vault, Special Agent Mark Rozzi felt something he rarely experienced: complete bafflement. Run his background again, Rozzi told his team. Everything. Military records, employment history, credit reports, traffic tickets. I want to know what this guy ate for breakfast 3 years ago. The profile that emerged over the next 48 hours made absolutely no sense. David Scott Ghantt, 27 years old, honorably discharged from the United States Army after serving his country without incident. Not so much as a speeding ticket on his record. He attended church regularly with his wife, Tammy. Lived in a modest mobile home. By all accounts, he was the epitome of middle-class, law-abiding America. This guy's cleaner than my grandmother, one agent muttered, flipping through the files. But the vault was empty, and David Ghantt was gone. The FBI launched into overdrive, conducting over 100 interviews in less than 2 days. They talked to everyone who'd ever known David. Family members, co-workers, army buddies, neighbors, even his dentist. The picture that emerged was contradictory and confusing. Some of David's co-workers at Loomis Fargo described him as a model employee, conscientious, reliable, proud of his work. David took his job seriously, one supervisor told agents. He'd work overtime whenever we needed him. Never complained, just showed up and did the work. But others painted a completely different portrait. He was disgruntled, a former colleague said, always talking about how he deserved better, how he was smarter than the job, like he was just waiting for something to change. His army buddies were utterly shocked when agents contacted them. David Ghantt pulled off a $17 million heist. One friend laughed into the phone, thinking it was a joke. Man, David could barely balance his checkbook. He's not exactly criminal mastermind material. Agent John Widra compiled the interviews into a psychological profile, but the more information they gathered, the less sense it made. We've got two completely different people here, he told Rozzy. Half the people we talked to describe a hard-working family man. The other half described someone ready to explode. Tammy Ghantt, David's wife, insisted her husband must have been kidnapped or coerced. David wouldn't do this, she told agents, her voice breaking. Someone must have forced him. Maybe they have him somewhere. Maybe he's hurt. The FBI wanted to believe her. They really did. Because the alternative, that this average guy just decided one day to rob his employer of $17 million, seemed almost impossible. Then they found something in David's pickup truck that changed everything. Tucked in the ashtray, deliberately placed where it couldn't be missed, was David's wedding ring. Agent Dick Womble held the gold band up to the light, turning it slowly. He left this here on purpose, Womble said. This isn't an accident. He's sending a message. What kind of message? Rozzy asked. That he's done. Finished with his old life. He's cutting ties with his wife, his family, everything he used to be. The wedding ring suggested premeditation. Careful planning. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or desperation. David Ghantt had thought this through. But as the FBI dug deeper into David's personal life, they discovered something interesting. Multiple people mentioned that David had been particularly close to a former Loomis Fargo employee named Kelly Campbell. Very close. Kelly had worked at Loomis for several years alongside David. Co-workers remembered seeing them together often, sharing lunch breaks, laughing at inside jokes, staying late after shifts. Even after Kelly quit her job about a year before the heist, people reported seeing them meet up occasionally. They were definitely close, one co-worker told agents. Whether it was romantic or just friendship, I couldn't say. But David lit up when Kelly was around. The FBI immediately placed Kelly Campbell at the top of their persons of interest list. 2 agents knocked on her door within 48 hours of the robbery. Kelly answered, looking surprised but composed. She invited the agents inside her modest home and listened calmly as they explained why they were there. I heard about what happened, Kelly said, shaking her head in apparent disbelief. I can't believe David would do something like that. When was the last time you spoke with David? Agent Womble asked. Oh, it's been months, Kelly replied smoothly. Maybe longer. We worked together back in the day, but after I left Loomis, we didn't really keep in touch. The agents exchanged glances. That wasn't what other people had told them. So you weren't close friends? Rozzy pressed. Not really, Kelly said with a slight shrug. We were friendly at work, sure, but nothing beyond that. Every instinct Rozzy had honed over 15 years with the FBI screamed that Kelly Campbell was lying. Her body language, her carefully chosen words, the way she downplayed her relationship with David, it all felt rehearsed, calculated. But they had nothing concrete. No evidence tying her to the crime. Just a gut feeling and conflicting witness statements. We may need to speak with you again, Rozzy said as they stood to leave. Don't leave town. Kelly smiled pleasantly. Of course. Whatever you need. As the agents walked back to their car, Womble shook his head. She's involved. I'd bet my badge on it. Agreed, Rozzy said. But involved in what? Planning a heist? Helping David disappear? We need proof. That proof came sooner than expected, but not in the way they anticipated. Late Monday afternoon, 2 days after the robbery, a man cutting grass in a wooded area less than 10 miles from the Loomis Fargo warehouse made a startling discovery. Hidden among the trees, partially concealed by branches and brush, was the missing Loomis van. FBI agents swarmed the scene within minutes. The van was locked tight, and they had to wait for a locksmith to arrive before they could access it. When the doors finally swung open, what they found inside stunned everyone. Stacks of cash. Bundles and bundles of $20 bills, still wrapped in Loomis Fargo bands. They counted it right there in the field. $3.3 million, just abandoned in the back of the van. Why would they leave this behind? An agent wondered aloud. Also in the van, the two missing surveillance tapes from the warehouse, David Gantt's service pistol still in its holster, and both sets of vault keys. Rozzi studied the scene carefully. They ran out of time, he concluded, or they couldn't carry it all. $3 million in small bills. That's a lot of weight, a lot of volume. Maybe they got spooked. But something else bothered him. The tapes were in the van, not destroyed. The weapon was left behind, not disposed of. The keys were sitting right there on the console. This feels sloppy, Rozzi said. Like they panicked. Or like they're amateurs, Widra added. Back at the FBI field office, Agent Mark Rozzi stood in front of the evidence board, which was now covered with photographs, maps, and notes. At the center was a picture of David Ghantt, clean-cut, unremarkable, looking more like a bank teller than a bank robber. Rozzi stared at that photograph for a long time, trying to make the pieces fit together. David Ghantt had no history of violence, no apparent motive beyond credit card debt that half of America also carried, no criminal connections that the FBI could find. And yet, he'd successfully stolen over $17 million and vanished without a trace. Well, not entirely without a trace. They'd recovered $3 million. That meant $14 million was still out there, somewhere, in the hands of David Ghantt and whoever helped him pull this off. This man doesn't make sense, Rozzi said to the room. Everything we know about him says he shouldn't be capable of this. But he did it. So who is David Ghantt, really? And more importantly, who helped him? He tapped Kelly Campbell's photograph on the board. She's lying to us. I know it. But about what? The FBI had recovered some money, found the van, and identified a potential accomplice. But David Ghantt remained a ghost. No credit card activity. No bank withdrawals. No confirmed sightings. It was as if he'd simply evaporated. Outside the field office, night was falling over Charlotte. Somewhere out there, David Ghantt was breathing free air, probably counting stolen money and thinking he'd gotten away with it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his accomplices were about to make mistakes so catastrophically stupid that they'd lead the FBI straight to his doorstep. The perfect heist was about to become the dumbest disaster in criminal history. And it would all start with people who simply couldn't resist spending money they hadn't earned. While the FBI was tearing apart David Gantt's life looking for clues, a completely separate investigation was beginning 15 miles away in Gaston County. Sergeant Jeff Rome had been working narcotics cases for years, building relationships with informants who fed him information about drug dealers, money laundering operations, and criminal activity throughout the county. So when one of his most reliable sources called him with a tip that had nothing to do with drugs, Rome listened carefully. There's this guy who just bought a house up on Kramer Mountain, the informant said. Paid cash. $600,000. The whole thing in cash. Rome leaned forward in his chair. Who's the buyer? Steve Chambers. You know him? Rome knew him all right. Steve Chambers was a small-time crook with a rap sheet that read like a greatest hits compilation of petty crimes, bad checks, small-time bookmaking, operating as a fence for stolen goods. Nothing major. Nothing that would suggest he had access to $600,000 in legitimate money. Steve Chambers, Rome repeated slowly. The same Steve Chambers who's been unemployed for the past 2 years? Living in a trailer with his wife, Michelle. That's the one, the informant confirmed. Moved into that fancy gated community about 6 weeks ago. Brand new mansion. Paid cash. Rome hung up the phone and immediately started digging. What he found made his detective instincts go into overdrive. Kramer Mountain was one of the most exclusive addresses in Gaston County, a gated community in the tiny town of Kramerton, population 2,500. The town itself was famous for exactly one thing, having the shortest main street in the Guinness Book of World Records at just 75 feet long. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where sudden wealth didn't go unnoticed. and Steve and Michelle Chambers were making themselves very, very noticeable. Rome started running surveillance, and what he observed was almost comical. Steve purchased a brand new pickup truck, paid in cash. Michelle rolled up to luxury car dealerships and drove away in a BMW convertible, also cash. They bought tanning beds for their home, hired an expensive interior decorator, started throwing money around like it grew on trees in their backyard. The stories they told their new neighbors were even more absurd. Steve claimed he was a retired professional football player for the Dallas Cowboys. The problem? Nobody in Cramerton, including several diehard Cowboys fans, had ever heard of Steve Chambers. He was 5'9" and built like a guy who spent more time at bars than at the gym. When pressed for details, Michelle would smile and explain that Steve had won big gambling in Atlantic City. Oh, and he was also selling several laundromats he owned in Texas. The money was just rolling in from multiple sources, she'd say with a wave of her hand. None of it made any sense. Rome knew Steve Chambers. The man was a bookie and a small-time fence, not a real estate mogul or professional athlete. Something was very wrong here. Meanwhile, tips were flooding into the FBI hotline about the Loomis Fargo robbery. In the days following the heist, hundreds of calls poured in. People reporting suspicious neighbors, sudden wealth, anything that seemed out of place. One call caught Agent Mark Rozzi's attention immediately. Eric Payne, who worked at Reynolds and Reynolds Printing Company, directly across the street from where the abandoned Loomis van was discovered, was suddenly spending money like he'd won the lottery. Brand new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Chevy Tahoe with all the upgrades. First-class plane tickets for an expensive vacation. And here's where it got truly bizarre. Eric paid for breast implants for both of his sisters. His wife got breast augmentation and a nose job. All of it paid in cash. Who does that? Widra asked, reading through the tip reports. Who pays for their sisters to get breast implants? Someone with more money than sense, Rozzi replied. More tips came in about the Chambers family. Michelle was paying for everything, and I mean everything, in thick packets of $20 bills. Groceries, furniture, clothing, restaurant tabs. She'd pull out rubber-banded stacks of 20s and peel off bills like she was dealing cards at a casino. Then came the most outrageous story. Steve Chambers had been thrown out of a local bar for causing a disturbance. Furious at the humiliation, he returned the next day and offered to buy the entire establishment for $400,000 in cash. Right there, on the spot. The bar owner, stunned, told him to get lost. Cramerton's mayor, Kathy Biles, lived just 3 doors down from the Chambers mansion. She watched with increasing alarm as this couple, who'd been unemployed and living in a mobile home mere weeks ago, suddenly had more money than they could possibly spend. None of the men in our neighborhood had ever heard of Steve Chambers as a football player, Mayor Biles later told investigators. And believe me, we have some serious Cowboys fans here. If he played for Dallas, someone would have remembered. The whole story just didn't add up. She wasn't the only one noticing. The small-town grapevine was buzzing. Who were these people? Where did this money come from? Within weeks, 8 different informants had contacted Sergeant Rome with information about the Chambers family's suspicious spending habits. Rome made the connection before the FBI did. He picked up the phone and called the Charlotte FBI field office, asking to speak with the agents working the Loomis Fargo case. I think you need to take a look at Steve and Michelle Chambers, Rome told Agent Rozzi. I've been watching them for a narcotics investigation, but this doesn't feel like drug money. The timing is too perfect. The amount is too large. And these people are spending like there's no tomorrow. The FBI immediately put surveillance teams on the Chambers. What they observed was criminal behavior so reckless it bordered on performance art. Michelle Chambers made the mistake that would eventually bring down the entire operation. FBI agents watched through telephoto lenses as Michelle walked into a Nations Bank branch carrying a briefcase. She approached a teller and, according to the suspicious activity report the teller filed afterward, Michelle asked a very specific question. How much money can I deposit before I have to sign any paperwork? The teller, immediately suspicious, asked where the money came from. Michelle laughed and assured her it definitely wasn't drug money. Then she made a sizable deposit in cash. The teller filed a report the moment Michelle left. The FBI subpoenaed the bank's records and discovered something extraordinary. Michelle had been making large cash deposits at multiple banks across 3 counties. And some of that cash was still wrapped in the original money bands. Money bands from Loomis Fargo. One band in particular caught their attention. It still bore handwritten initials, a notation made by a Loomis employee before the robbery as part of standard cash handling procedures. The FBI traced those initials back to a specific employee who hadn't worked in the vault since the day of the heist. It was conclusive proof. The Chambers were spending stolen Loomis money. "We've got them," Rozzi said, staring at the evidence. "But we've got a problem." The problem was simple. They still couldn't connect Steve Chambers to David Ghantt. How did these 2 men know each other? How did a vault supervisor hook up with a small-time crook from Gaston County? The FBI pulled Steve Chambers' entire life history, employment records, criminal background, known associates, family connections. Nothing tied him to David Ghantt. They never worked together, lived in the same neighborhoods, or shared any obvious connections. Then they turned their attention back to Kelly Campbell. She'd been evasive during her initial interview, downplaying her relationship with David. But what if she was more than just a former co-worker? What if she was the bridge between David and whoever helped him pull off the heist? FBI agents requisitioned high school yearbooks from all the local schools, looking for any possible connection. They spread the annuals across a conference table, page after page of teenage faces frozen in time. Agent Dick Womble was flipping through Steve Chambers' high school yearbook when he stopped suddenly. "Got something," he said. There, in a class photo from years earlier, was a younger version of Kelly Campbell. She and Steve Chambers had gone to the same high school. They would have known each other for years, maybe decades. Rozzi stood up, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Kelly is the link. She knew David from Loomis Fargo. She knew Steve Chambers from high school. She connected them. "So, where's David Ghantt?" Widra asked. Rozzi stared at the evidence board, now covered with surveillance photos of the Chambers mansion, spending receipts, and bank records showing deposits of stolen money. "David's the one who took the money," Rozzi said slowly. "But Steve Chambers is the one spending it, which means either David's dead." He paused. Or he's sitting somewhere wondering why his partners aren't sending him his cut. Either way, the FBI now had a clear picture of the conspiracy. Kelly Campbell recruited David Ghantt. Steve Chambers organized the logistics. Eric Payne and others helped move the money. But they still needed to find David before his accomplices decided he'd become too much of a liability to keep alive. The morning of October 4th, 1997, David Ghantt woke up before dawn and did something he'd never done before. He sat at his tiny kitchen table and calculated exactly how long it would take to pay off his credit card debt, making minimum payments. The answer made him feel sick. 30 years, 3 decades of his life, chained to payments on purchases he could barely remember making. 30 years of Tammy watching every dollar, questioning every expense, keeping him on a budget so tight he couldn't breathe. 30 years of feeling invisible, insignificant, stuck. He looked around the mobile home he shared with his wife, the cramped rooms, the worn furniture, the life that felt more like a cage than a home. Then he thought about Kelly Campbell's promise, whispered to him weeks ago over lunch. "We could be free, David. Really free. For maybe $5 million each. Just you, me, and my friend. We split it 3 ways and disappear. Mexico. Beaches. No more counting pennies. No more feeling small." David stood up, walked into the bedroom where Tammy slept, and kissed her forehead gently. She didn't stir. He took one last look at her peaceful face, knowing he'd never see her again, and walked out the door. He drove to Loomis Fargo for his final shift, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. The heist itself went almost perfectly, at least at first. David worked methodically, doing exactly what he'd planned for weeks. When the trainee finished his shift, David sent him home with a casual wave. "I'll lock up. You go ahead. Long day tomorrow." The moment the trainee's car disappeared down the road, David opened the vault and stared at the fortune before him. Mountains of cash. Stacks and stacks of $20 bills, shrink-wrapped and banded, waiting for ATM machines that would never receive them. He loaded the white Ford van for 90 minutes straight, his muscles screaming, sweat pouring down his face. Nearly 3,000 pounds of currency. His pager kept buzzing with messages from Kelly waiting outside. 143. 143. 143. 143. I love you. The code they'd agreed on. When David finally finished, exhausted and exhilarated, he climbed into the van and drove toward the gate. That's when the first thing went wrong. The chain-link gate wouldn't open. David jiggled the handle, pulled harder, panic rising in his throat. He was trapped inside the compound with 17 million stolen dollars and no way out. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, a man David had never seen before. The stranger walked up, grabbed the gate, and yanked it open with a grunt. Go, the man said. Move. David's blood went cold. Kelly had promised it was just the three of them, her, David, and her mysterious friend who'd helped them hide the money. But who was this guy? How many other people were involved? He didn't have time to think about it. He drove through the gate and headed toward the rendezvous point at the Reynolds and Reynolds printing plant parking lot, where Kelly and the others were waiting. What happened next would have been comical if it weren't so terrifying. The gang couldn't open the armored van. The key David had given them was on a ring with 200 other Loomis keys, and nobody could figure out which one fit the van's lock. Someone, David never learned who, actually fired a gun at the van's bulletproof windows. The bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the reinforced glass, pinging into the darkness. Finally, they found the right key and the doors swung open. The gang stood frozen, staring at the fortune packed inside. Mountains of cash, more money than any of them had ever seen in one place. But there was a problem. There was too much. Way too much. They'd brought 3 blue plastic barrels to carry the money. They filled all 3 to the brim and still had stacks of small bills left over. Over $3 million worth that they simply abandoned in the van because they'd run out of space and time. David and Kelly climbed into her car for the drive to Columbia, South Carolina, where David would catch a bus to Atlanta, then a flight to Mexico. This was supposed to be the moment, the beginning of their new life together. When are you coming down? David asked as they drove through the darkness. Soon, Kelly promised. Just give me a few weeks to tie up loose ends. Then, I'll meet you in Cancun, and we'll figure out where to go from there. At the Columbia bus station, reality hit David hard. He'd expected to take $4 or $5 million to Mexico, his share of the split. Instead, Kelly handed him $30,000 stuffed into cut-up pantyhose because David, in all his careful planning, had never thought about how to actually carry large amounts of cash through airport security. This is just for now, Kelly said, seeing the disappointment on his face. Once things cool down, we'll get you the rest. I promise. She kissed him then, long and deep, the kind of kiss that made David believe everything would work out. Then she drove away, leaving him standing alone in a bus station parking lot with 30 grand in pantyhose and a fake passport. It was the last time David Ghantt ever saw Kelly Campbell. The first few weeks in Cancun felt like the dream Kelly had promised. David rented a nice hotel room, ate at good restaurants, walked on beaches at sunset. But he was completely alone. Kelly didn't call. Days turned into weeks. His money was disappearing faster than he'd anticipated. Mexico wasn't cheap, especially the way David was living. He called Kelly, tried to keep his voice steady. Hey, I'm running a little low. Can you send me some more money? Maybe $50,000. A week later, a man showed up at David's hotel. He introduced himself as Bruno. He handed David a small envelope containing $8,000. Where's the rest? David asked. Bruno shrugged. That's what they gave me to bring you. 50,000 had become 8,000. David's stomach twisted with the first real stirrings of fear. Then came the moment that shattered his illusion completely. David was eating dinner at a restaurant when an American tourist approached his table. Hey man, you know who you look like? The tourist said, grinning. That guy who stole $20 million in North Carolina. It's been all over the news. David forced a laugh. Yeah, I get that a lot. Crazy, right? But inside, he was panicking. The story wasn't dying down. His face was everywhere. And here he was, sitting in a tourist-heavy resort town like an idiot. Weeks crawled by. David's money dwindled to almost nothing. He stopped eating at restaurants, started buying comic books at street vendors, to pass the time. Listen to the same Eagles CD over and over in his hotel room. The isolation was suffocating. Then one afternoon, there was a knock on his door. David opened it to find a man he'd never seen before. "My name's Robert," the man said. "We need to talk." David let him in, confused. Robert didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Bruno works for the people in Charlotte," he said flatly. "They're planning to kill you." "What's the deal with that?" David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "What are you talking about?" "Come on, man. Don't play stupid. Bruno's been watching you. They're putting together a plan to take you out. I figured you should know." David gave Robert $2,000, nearly the last of his cash, to keep quiet and leave. After Robert left, David sat on the edge of his bed, hands shaking, piecing together the horrifying truth. Kelly had never planned to join him. Steve Chambers, whoever he was, had never planned to share the money. David was a loose end, a witness who could put them all in prison. Of course, they wanted him dead. He started moving hotels every few nights, using fake names, venturing out only after dark. He was trapped in paradise with no money, no friends, and killers potentially around every corner. The smart thing would have been to turn himself in. Contact the FBI. Make a deal. But David couldn't let go of the fantasy. Kelly had kissed him. She'd promised they'd be together. Maybe if he could just talk to her, explain that he wasn't a threat, that he'd never rat them out. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay silent, David picked up the phone in his cheap hotel room and dialed Kelly's number. "I need to talk to you," he said when she answered. "Things are getting bad down here. I think there are people looking for me." Kelly's voice was cold, distant, nothing like the warm tone he remembered. "Where are you exactly?" David hesitated. Then, desperate and foolish, he told her the truth. "I'm in Cozumel. Moved here a few weeks ago because Cancun felt too hot." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Stay where you are," Kelly said. "Someone will bring you money. Just stay put." She hung up. David sat in the darkness of his hotel room, staring at the phone, a sick feeling spreading through his chest. He just told Kelly, and whoever was listening, exactly where to find him. What David didn't know was that whoever was listening included the FBI. They'd had Kelly's phone tapped for weeks. They'd just heard every word of that conversation. And so had Steve Chambers, who was, at that very moment, finalizing plans to send Mike McKinney to Cozumel with orders to make sure David Ghantt never came back alive. The race was on, and David, sitting alone in paradise with no money and no way home, had no idea that two groups were now coming for him. One to arrest him, and one to kill him. The only question was which would arrive first. February 1998. 5 months had passed since David Ghantt walked out of that Loomis Fargo vault with $17 million. In the small town of Cramerton, North Carolina, the FBI had turned Steve and Michelle Chambers' mansion into the most heavily surveilled address in the state. Unmarked cars rotated positions on nearby streets. Small planes circled overhead at intervals, photographing comings and goings. Agents with telephoto lenses documented every movement, every visitor, every trip to the bank. Cramerton Police Chief David Young was fielding calls constantly. Worried residents kept reporting suspicious vehicles parked in their quiet neighborhood. Strange men sitting in cars for hours. Low-flying planes that seemed to circle the same area repeatedly. "I understand your concern," Chief Young would say patiently into the phone. "We're aware of the situation and it's under control." What he couldn't tell them was that those suspicious vehicles contained FBI agents, and those planes were federal surveillance aircraft. The operation had to remain secret. If the Chambers knew they were being watched, they'd lawyer up and the investigation would hit a wall. The FBI had documented everything. Over $1 million in cash deposits across multiple banks in 3 different counties. Safe deposit boxes opened in other people's names. Relatives and friends recruited to hide money. The purchase of M&S Furniture Gallery paid for entirely in cash. Luxury cars, jewelry, a mansion that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But surveillance alone wasn't enough. They needed something concrete, conversations, admissions, evidence that would hold up in court. Agent Mark Rossi went before a federal judge with everything they had. The Loomis money band, the suspicious deposits, the connections to Kelly Campbell and David Ghantt. The judge authorized wiretaps on the Chambers' home phone, Steve's cell phone, and the business line at their furniture store. The FBI set up a listening post and settled in for what they knew might be weeks or months of tedious monitoring. Most wiretap investigations were brutally boring. Hours of mundane conversations about groceries and television shows, interrupted by occasional useful intelligence. The first few weeks confirmed this. The FBI listened to Michelle discussing paint colors with interior decorators. Steve talking about hiring bodyguards. Apparently, he was worried about being robbed, which would have been ironic if it weren't so infuriating. Conversations about opening bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Talk of buying more property. It was all circumstantial. Suspicious, yes, but nothing that definitively proved murder conspiracy or directly tied them to the Loomis heist beyond the money band evidence. Then, on a cold February afternoon, everything changed. The FBI listening post recorded an incoming call to Steve Chambers from Kelly Campbell. The agents monitoring the line immediately sat up straighter, turning up the volume. Guess who I just heard from? Kelly's voice came through the speakers. Who? Steve asked, sounding distracted. Our friend in Mexico. There was a pause. The FBI agents exchanged glances. David Ghantt. She was talking about David Ghantt. What did he want? Steve's voice had gone cold. Money. What else? He says he's running low and needs us to send him more. This was the first confirmation the FBI had received that David Ghantt was alive and in Mexico. For 5 months, they'd feared he might be dead, buried somewhere in the North Carolina woods by accomplices who decided a dead partner was safer than a living witness. But he was alive, and apparently broke. Steve's response made the blood run cold in every agent's veins. The guy's causing a problem now, Steve said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. We need to finish this. Finish this. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Over the next several days, the FBI listened in growing horror as Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell discussed the logistics of murdering David Ghantt. They spoke in careful language, never saying the word kill or murder directly, but the meaning was unmistakable. Mike McKinney, codenamed Bruno in their conversations, had been on standby for months. Steve had been paying him $400 a week plus a hotel room, essentially keeping a hired killer on retainer until the moment was right. We need to know exactly where he is, Steve said during one call. No mistakes. McKinney goes down there, takes care of it, and that's the end of our problems. Kelly agreed to make contact with David and extract his precise location. The FBI now faced an impossible moral and tactical dilemma. Agent John Widra laid it out bluntly during an emergency strategy meeting. If we arrest them now, we can charge them with conspiracy based on these recordings. But David dies in Mexico because he'll never know McKinney is coming for him. If we wait too long, McKinney gets to David first, and we lose our star witness. We've got maybe a 48-hour window to thread this needle. Mark Rossi made the call. We go get David first. Coordinate with FBI offices in Mexico. We bring him in alive, then we take down the whole network simultaneously. But first, they had to find out exactly where David was hiding. The FBI didn't have to wait long. Kelly Campbell made the call to David, the same call where David, desperate and foolish, revealed he was staying in Cozumel. The FBI recorded every word. Stay where you are, Kelly told him, her voice devoid of warmth. Someone will bring you money. Just stay put. The moment she hung up, she called Steve Chambers. I've got it. Cozumel. I know exactly where he's staying. But the FBI wanted more than just wiretap evidence. They needed in-person confirmation, something that would be impossible for defense attorneys to spin or explain away. They sent an undercover agent into M&S Furniture Gallery, wearing a concealed recording device. The agent posed as a customer, browsing expensive leather sofas while Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell talked near the back office. The two had no idea they were being recorded. McKinney leaves in 2 days, Steve said, his voice low but clear enough for the wire to pick up. He'll take a couple guys with him. They fly to Cozumel, find our boy, and handle the problem. Then David won't be bothering us anymore. Kelly nodded. What if something goes wrong? Nothing's going to go wrong. McKinney knows what he's doing. David will just disappear. Another American tourist who got drunk and drowned or got mugged by locals. Happens all the time in Mexico. The undercover agent purchased a lamp he didn't need, thanked them for their help, and walked out with evidence that would put both Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell away for conspiracy to commit murder. Back at the FBI field office, Mark Rossi moved into crisis mode. He got on the phone with the FBI's legal attaché office in Mexico City. "We have an American citizen in Cozumel who's about to be assassinated," Rossi said without preamble. "His name is David Scott Ghantt. He's wanted for the Loomis Fargo robbery, but he's also a key witness, and we need him alive. I'm sending you his description and last known location. We have 48 hours, maybe less, before a hit squad arrives to kill him. We'll mobilize immediately," the agent in Mexico City responded. "But Cozumel is a big place. Hotels everywhere. If he's using a fake name—" "I know," Rossi interrupted. "Do your best. Canvas hotels. Show his photo. Find him before the killers do." Rossi hung up and turned to his team, gathered in the operations center. On the wall behind him were surveillance photos of Steve Chambers, Michelle Chambers, Kelly Campbell, Eric Payne, Mike McKinney, and at the center, David Ghantt, the unwitting patsy who'd stolen millions and was now marked for death by the very people he trusted. "This is it," Rossi said. "We've got two simultaneous operations running. 1. Find David Ghantt in Mexico and bring him in alive. 2. The moment David is in custody, we hit every target at once. Chambers, Campbell, McKinney, Payne, everybody goes down at the same time. We don't give them a chance to destroy evidence or flee." He looked at each agent in turn. "McKinney is scheduled to fly to Mexico in less than 48 hours. That means we have maybe 2 days to save David Gantt's life and take down this entire organization. What if we don't find him in time?" An agent asked quietly. Rossi's jaw tightened. "Then we arrest everyone we can and hope David's smart enough to turn himself in before McKinney finds him. But I'm not counting on David being smart. He's already proven he's terrible at making decisions." The room fell silent. Somewhere in Cozumel, Mexico, David Ghantt was hiding in a cheap hotel room, broke and terrified, with no idea that 2 teams were racing toward him, one to save his life and one to end it. The clock was ticking. March 1st, 1998. Cozumel, Mexico. 3 FBI agents stepped off a plane at Cozumel International Airport, carrying nothing but overnight bags and a photograph of David Ghantt. They had one mission, and the clock was already ticking. Find David before Mike McKinney's hit squad arrived and murdered the only witness who could bring down the entire conspiracy. No time for elaborate surveillance. No backup plan. No room for error. Agents Mark Rossi and John Widra, along with a Spanish-speaking agent from the Mexico City office, fanned out across the island's hotel district. They had the address Kelly had extracted from David during that final phone call, but hotels in Cozumel were plentiful and David had been using fake names. If he'd moved again, changed locations, panicked, and run, they might never find him in time. They showed David's photograph to desk clerks, bartenders, anyone who might have seen an American matching his description. Most shook their heads. One hotel manager paused, studied the photo, then nodded slowly. "I think I've seen this man. He checked in maybe 2 weeks ago. Keeps to himself. Pays cash." Rossi felt his pulse quicken. "What room?" "I cannot give that information without." Rossi pulled out his FBI credentials. "This man is in danger. We need to find him now." The manager made a phone call, consulted his records, and provided a room number. But when the agents knocked, there was no answer. The room was empty. They staked out the hotel, watching the entrance, scanning every face that passed. Hours crawled by. Rossi kept checking his watch. McKinney could be boarding a plane at this very moment. They might already be too late. Then, just after noon, they saw him. David Ghantt walked out of the hotel into the bright Mexican sunshine. Thin, sunburned, wearing clothes that had seen better days. He looked haunted, exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept well in months. His eyes darted nervously from side to side as he walked, the paranoid gait of someone who knew he was being hunted. The 3 agents moved in, approaching from different angles to cut off any escape route. David saw them coming. 3 men in casual clothes, moving with purpose, closing in on him. His hand instinctively moved toward his pocket. His mind raced. Was this the FBI? Or was this Bruno's crew? Here to finish him off? For a frozen moment, everything hung in balance. David could run. He could fight. He could make this messy. Instead, his voice cracked with desperate hope as he called out, "Please tell me you're an FBI agent." Mark Rossi stepped forward, hand extended. "I am." David's entire body sagged with relief, so profound it was almost physical. His knees buckled slightly. He'd been running for 5 months, hiding in paradise that had become a prison, waiting for either rescue or assassination. Now he knew which had arrived first. "We really need to talk," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, we do," Rossi agreed. David looked at the 3 agents, and despite everything, despite knowing he was about to be arrested, despite knowing his life as he knew it was over, he said something that caught Rossi off guard. "I'm really glad to see you." Rossi's response was almost gentle. "I'm glad to see you too, David." It was over. David Ghantt was in custody, alive and breathing, exactly 24 hours before Mike McKinney's hired killers were scheduled to arrive in Cozumel. The race had been won by minutes. Within hours, David was on a plane back to Charlotte, accompanied by federal agents. He talked the entire flight, unburdening himself of months of fear and betrayal. He told them everything: Kelly's recruitment, Steve Chambers' plan, the murder plot, the paltry $30,000 he'd received instead of the millions promised. He gave them names, dates, locations, bank accounts. By the time the plane touched down in North Carolina, the FBI had everything they needed. March 2nd, 1998. Charlotte, North Carolina. Dawn. The coordinated raids happened simultaneously across 3 counties. At the Chambers mansion in Cramerton, Steve answered a frantic phone call just after sunrise. A Charlotte police officer on the line informed him that his furniture store had been burglarized. Broken windows, major damage, possible theft. Steve needed to come down immediately. Steve threw on clothes and rushed outside, where FBI agents swarmed from unmarked vehicles like wasps from a disturbed nest. "FBI, get on the ground." Steve Chambers, small-time crook turned multimillionaire, hit the pavement face first. His empire was over before he'd finished his morning coffee. Inside the mansion, agents found cash everywhere. $720,000 hidden throughout the house, stuffed in shoe boxes and closets, stacked in blue barrels in the basement, tucked into desk drawers and behind books. They found Michelle upstairs in the master bedroom, still wearing her $43,000 diamond ring, looking utterly shocked as agents placed her in handcuffs. Money-counting machines ran for 2 solid days, processing the recovered cash. At Kelly Campbell's house, agents executed their warrant at dawn. They seized jewelry, appliances still in boxes, bundles of cash, credit cards used to buy luxury items. Kelly's face when they told her David was alive and cooperating was priceless. Genuine shock mixed with the dawning realization that she'd badly underestimated the man she'd manipulated. Mike McKinney was grabbed at his Gastonia hotel room before he could pack his bags for Mexico. The conspiracy to commit murder charges carried a heavier sentence than simple robbery. His career as a hired killer ended in handcuffs and a public defender he couldn't afford. Eric Payne, the man who'd paid for breast implants for his sisters with stolen money, watched from his front window as FBI agents impounded his Harley-Davidson and his Chevy Tahoe. Those implants had just cost him years of his freedom. In total, 21 people were arrested that morning. The FBI recovered nearly $10 million from safe deposit boxes opened in relatives' names, from home stashes, from bank accounts across 3 states. But $7 million was still missing, spent on tanning beds, Velvet Elvis paintings, luxury cars, and the most spectacularly stupid spending spree in criminal history. The courtroom proceedings moved with brutal efficiency. 20 defendants took one look at the evidence, surveillance footage, wiretap recordings, David Gantt's testimony, and pleaded guilty immediately. Only one person demanded a trial: Jeffrey Guller, Steve Chambers' attorney, who'd laundered money for his client. A jury convicted him in less than 3 hours. The sentences came down hard. Steve Chambers received 11 years and 3 months. Mike McKinney got 11 years and 6 months for conspiracy to commit murder. Michelle Chambers received 7 years and 8 months. David Ghantt, despite cooperating fully, got 7 years and 6 months. His sentence only slightly reduced because he'd been the one to actually steal the money. Kelly Campbell received 5 years and 10 months, the lightest sentence of all the principal defendants, in exchange for her cooperation. She never apologized to David, never explained why she'd thought murder was preferable to sharing a few $1,000,000. She simply disappeared into the federal prison system in West Virginia, refusing all interview requests. None of the defendants could afford their own attorneys. The court appointed public defenders for people who'd briefly been millionaires. They were all ordered to pay millions in restitution that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Every paycheck garnished, every tax return seized. February 1999. Charlotte, North Carolina. Over 5,000 people descended on Charlotte for the public auction of seized items from the Loomis Fargo heist. It became a cultural phenomenon, a chance to own a piece of criminal history. Michelle Chambers' BMW convertible sold for top dollar. Steve's Velvet Elvis painting, purchased for thousands in stolen cash, went to the highest bidder amid laughter from the crowd. Furniture from a mansion, the tanning beds, the Harley-Davidson that had cost Eric Payne his freedom. The absurdity reached its peak when mundane items, a lamp, a coffee table, a set of dishes, sold for premium prices simply because they were part of the dumbest heist in America. The auction raised $360,000 for Lloyd's of London, Loomis Fargo's insurance company. It was a fraction of what was stolen, but at least it was something. Federal Correctional Institution, Butner, North Carolina. Several years later, David Ghantt sat across from a reporter in the prison visiting room, wearing standard-issue khaki, looking older than his years. His marriage to Tammy had ended in divorce a month into his sentence. His family barely spoke to him. When released, he'd be middle-aged with a felony record and millions in unpaid restitution following him forever. "Do you regret what you did?" the reporter asked. David paused. He looked out the window at the prison yard, considering the question. Then he smiled, the same reckless, boyish smile he'd worn while loading that van with $17 million. "Would I do it again?" "Yeah." The reporter blinked, surprised. Even knowing everything that happened, David shrugged. "An opportunity like that comes around once in a lifetime. I'm already in prison. I've already been judged. So yeah, sure, I'd do it again." It was a statement that revealed David Ghantt had learned nothing. He remained the same dreamer who'd convinced himself that stealing $17 million was justified, that Kelly loved him, that he could outrun consequences. Prison hadn't changed him. It had simply confirmed what he already believed. Life isn't fair, and at least he'd taken a shot. Agent Mark Rossi, reflecting on the case years later from his FBI office, had a different perspective. "We wanted it all. We wanted David Ghantt back, safe and sound. We wanted all the people responsible for the crime. And we wanted the money, as much as we could recover. In the end, the FBI got it all." He paused, then added, "Well, except for $7 million. That money's gone forever, spent on stupidity." The empty Loomis Fargo vault in Charlotte sits quiet now, just a hollow concrete room where $17.3 million once sat in neat, organized stacks. A janitor sweeps the floor occasionally, unaware of the history that unfolded here. The vault door swings shut with a heavy metallic thud, the same sound it made on October 4th, 1997, just before David Ghantt loaded the last stack of cash and drove away into infamy. This dumb American heist baffled the FBI. Not because it was brilliant, but because it proved that even intelligent people make spectacularly stupid choices when greed takes the wheel. David Ghantt successfully stole millions and crossed international borders. But his accomplices' inability to keep quiet, stop spending, or resist the urge to commit murder transformed what should have been the perfect crime into America's most laughable disaster. 21 arrests, nearly 10 million recovered. A murder plot foiled by hours. And one stubborn thief who still insists, even from behind bars, that it was all worth it. Some people never learn. And that's exactly what makes this story so chillingly, perfectly dumb. Thank you for watching. We hope you sure learned a thing or two from David Ghantt. Don't forget to click that subscribe button, like the video, and tell me where you're watching from. Also, click on the image on your screen to watch more thrilling true crime cases and stay updated with our latest content.